Hello guys, I'm really happy to be today at the Lviv Media Forum and also to share a very interesting conversation with you today. We are going to speak about the collapse of the Russian Federation with a person that knows a lot about that. And I'm really happy that today on the channel I will introduce you to a famous Ukrainian intellectual and also a chairman of the Decolonization NGO, Valerii Pekar. Many people in Ukraine believe that true victory in the Russian war against Ukraine is only possible after the dissolution of the Russian Federation. And at the same time, we see that a lot of people abroad, our friends, our partner countries, are very much afraid of the collapse of Russia, and sometimes it is even felt as if they are more afraid of the collapse of the Russian Federation than the Ukraine's defeat. Do you think these are justified fears, and how likely that all is?
Let's start with reasons. Let's start with the not Ukrainian interest, but with interest of national security of European countries and Northern America. So the question is not what is good for Ukraine, what is bad for Ukraine. Let's start with a good question: how to ensure national security of United States in 21st century in opposition with growing China. How to ensure national security of Canada and Australia. How to ensure sustainable peace in Europe. And to answer this question, we should consider different scenarios in Russia. What is possible in Russia? Is it possible just that Putin dies and immediately democracy is installed in Russia? No. Because to have democracy, you need first Democrats. There are no democratic people in Russia. Now again, there are no Democrats. There are many people with different autocratic mood. There are many people with resentment, many people speaking about greatness of Soviet Union and so on. And second, democratic institutions. Are there any political parties, NGOs, independent media, independent courts, police which protects street political activities and so on? Are there anything of that in Russia? No. Here I would like to remind famous Russian philosopher of previous century, Nikolai Berdyaev, who said that from February to October of 1917, all possible political parties and ideologies marched in the front of the eyes of a Russian man. And what Russian man chose? What he had: Tsar and empire. The end of the quote. So democracy isn't possible simply by death of Putin, because real power in Russian Federation belongs to FSB, to oligarchs and so on. So what is possible? Is Putin alive or dies? There are two different scenarios which Western policymakers, analysts and scholars see. First scenario is consolidation of imperial power. Strong Moscow, consolidation, even more war economy, even more repressions against those who I don't agree with the war continuation, more mobilization, more weapon. What does it mean? Escalation of the war, very high probability of nuclear escalation, very high probability of invasion to NATO territories. And indeed, this is bad for America, this is bad for Europe. Another scenario which they see: collapse of the empire. Chaotic collapse of everything, no power in Moscow. What does it mean? Unacceptable risks. Proliferation of nuclear weapon, growth of radical Islamism, humanitarian crisis, millions of refugees, war everybody against everybody, enormous growth of Chinese influence. This is bad for Europe, this is bad for America. Two scenarios, both are bad for Europe, both are bad for America. How it is possible? Today, Euro-Atlantic civilization, Western civilization, is the major civilization on the planet, with a major military power, with a major economic power. How it is possible that all scenarios are bad? And at the same time, all scenarios are good for China. Either consolidated empire is good for China because this country is becoming more and more satellite of China, or total collapse is good for China. China simply enters and takes whatever possible. So China wins in all scenarios. America loses, Europe loses in all scenarios. How it is possible that major civilization is losing anyway? Trying to find an answer, we should look into the traditional books on strategy. And traditional books on strategy told us, if you see only bad scenarios, someone reframes your reality. Someone creates a frame for you that you can see only bad scenarios. All good scenarios are out of your scope. And sorry, but Ukrainian proverb says, if a beast swallowed you, you have at least two ways to go further. And why Western policymakers and analysts and scholars are trapped in this false frame? This is a trap of so-called Moscow centrism. Remember, we spoke about imperial center, about Moscow. Strong Moscow means consolidation, which is bad. Weak Moscow means collapse, which is bad. One bit of information, is Moscow strong, is Moscow weak? One bit of information creates two scenarios, and both are bad. What to do? Again, look into the strategic books and we see, avoid this framing. Expand your scenario analysis. Expand your vision. Accept reality as wider than the frame which your enemy creates for you. And you will see more scenarios. Let's add another bit of information. What is being held in regions? Nobody in the West, nobody in Europe, nobody in America studies Russian regions. This is a trap of Moscow centrism. And this trap of Moscow centrism appeared not 3 years ago, not 10 years ago, and not 30 years ago, after Second World War. And we Ukrainians know this trap of Moscow centrism pretty well, because in August 1st, 1991, President of the United States, Bush, visited Kiev to speak from the tribune of Ukrainian parliament. That time it was communist quasi-parliament, and demanded from Ukrainians to forget about independence, to preserve Soviet Union. It was August 1st. August 24, Ukraine proclaimed its independence. This speech was mocked by many political scientists around the world and got the name Chicken Kiev. Now I see the same. When I was young, I saw Chicken Kiev. Now I see Chicken Tartar, the second dish of the same series. So again, nobody would like to look outside Moscow. Again, there are hidden nations. 35 years ago, nobody in Russian studies, so-called Russian studies, would like to look at Ukrainians, Estonians, Georgians, Kazakhs. Now all these countries, all these nations appear on the map, but who now knows about Chechens, Tatars, Bashkirs, Buryats, and so on? Who knows in America that the key for national security of America in 21st century is not Greenland, but Republic of Sakha? Who knows that? And since we avoid trap of Moscow centrism and take second bit of information, what has been held in the region? Immediately, we see two other scenarios. Either creation of real federation in Russia, we call it refederalization, which means strong center but strong regions. This will eliminate the war. Why? Because regions are not interested in that. Regions are interested in investment in local economy, in local culture, and so on. And they will simply veto any Moscow offer to wage a new imperial war. Or weak Moscow, strong regions, decolonization scenario with creation of new states. We shouldn't be afraid of that, because this eliminates our risks. But there will be no risk of nuclear proliferation. denuclearization is the major point of their program. There will be no humanitarian crisis because they would like to be islands of security, stability, and order. No radical Islamism, because Islamic nationalists are major opponents of Islamic radicals. And no Chinese influence, because all Turkic and Mongol people, they hate Chinese, they are afraid of Chinese, and they are fighting for their freedom now, and they are dreaming about their freedom now from Moscow, not to be dependent on Beijing. So two good scenarios, which are invisible if we are Moscow-centered. That is why I don't want to start speaking with the Americans and Europeans with the term of decolonization, of collapse, or something like that. I would like to start speaking about national security of their own countries. How to ensure this? And we immediately will come to the idea of decolonization and deimperialization. And finally, we have several political resolutions of European Parliament, of Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, of Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, stating that decolonization, deimperialization of Russia is the only way to democracy and the only way to sustainable peace in Europe.
Thank you so much. That is actually an answer to a number of my questions. And it is indeed very important to forget about that classical Russian Kremlin framing that Moscow is the center, and whether Moscow is strong or weak, both case scenarios are not good. And this idea of different strong federation or on country, strong national states is definitely great and something we need to talk more about. What I feel on the channel when I read the comments of people who want to know more, at the very beginning they've shared with me openly that keep it simple about Ukraine, because for decades your country seemed like a rebellious part of big Russia. And I do understand that many of really smart people, or people who care for the freedom of Ukraine, do not know much about the Russian Federation. And my next question is, please, as an author of that really great phrase, "Make Russia small again."
I am not.
But I mean, okay, not an author, but...
Ukrainian philosopher Vakhtan Kebuladze is an author of that one.
So thank you so much, Vakhtan Kebuladze, for that phrase. But I believe we are definitely popularizers of that phrase. And that could be a slogan of freedom-loving people. Could you explain to this wider audience the difference between Russia and the Russian Federation that we have now, or that classical Moscow, or how to make them see the Republic of Sakha, how to make them understand that Chechnya is not Russia and they don't identify as Russians? Because for many, this largest country in the world seems all the same.
Russia is a colonial empire. When Russia appeared, it was just a small territory which then started to conquer other territories with other peoples. Mm-hmm. And if we shall read through histories of different conquered nations, mm-hmm. we shall see absolutely the same stories. Invasion, then puppet government, sometimes agreement which was broken, mm-hmm. then Russification, reducing of use of language, culture, religion, efforts to transform everybody to Russians, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of identity, murder of all intellectuals, mm-hmm. poets, philosophers, priests, and so on, artificial famine, deportation, exploitation of natural resources without any penny, yeah. any penny to local people, and finally, mobilization mm-hmm. of those people to conquer next lands. So, and take a look to the map of expansion of Russian Empire, including Alaska, by the way, mm-hmm. including Poland and Finland. Don't forget about that. And we shall see the same stories again and again and again. Sometimes it was, now everybody knows about Ukrainian Holodomor, mm-hmm. but very similar was in Kazakhstan, in Bashkortostan. Many people know about deportation of Crimean Tatars. But the same with Chechens and Gush and many other nations of Northern Caucasus. So all those stories more or less are similar. So this is the imperial way of doing things. And Russia as a colonial empire should be compared not with overseas empires like British Empire, Spanish Empire and so on, but with landmass empire like Austrian and Ottoman Turkish Empire. Both of them were huge land masses inhabited by very different people, sometimes nations with the tradition of statehood much longer than the tradition of statehood of the center, of imperial center. By the way, Tartar statehood was older than Moscow, for instance. Sometimes these nations had cultures much higher and well developed and well formed than cultures of conquerors. So conquerors came as barbarians.
Just as now.
Just as now. Take Georgian culture or Ukrainian culture or many other examples. And these three empires are very similar. But two of them already ceased to exist. One still exists. But this empire already dissoluted twice in 20th century. First in 1917, when Poland and Finland became independent. Now nobody thinks about Poland and Finland and former colonies. They are strong, independent states with high culture and enormous economic growth. They were also
NATO. And NATO.
And NATO and EU, and they were colonies of Russian Empire just 100 years ago. That time already also Baltic states became free, but not for a long time, unfortunately, because of Pact Molotov-Ribbentrop. And 1991, when 14 different nations broke free, like Ukrainians, Georgians, Estonians, again, Kazakhs, and so on. And several dozens other are still there. Chechens and Tartars and others wanted to be free that time in the beginning of 90s, but it was a lack of international recognition that time, which allows them, Moscow, to eliminate their first efforts of independence. So this territory is not inhabited by Russians. There are different nations, different cultures, different religions. Take even religious. There are Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Tengrians, and some specific local religions. There are dozens of languages. All those people, all those nations still alive. They still dream about freedom. They still save their cultures, languages, religions. They are suppressed. Their culture and language are being eliminated, and the mechanics of that was described in one of the statements of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe last year in details, how Russia Russifies everything and erases identities, languages, cultures, religions, traditions, and so on. Even official Russian propaganda acknowledges that the number of Russians is permanently decreasing and the number of non-Russians is permanently increasing in Russia. This creates a certain demographic disbalance between Russians and non-Russians. That is one of the reasons to conquer Ukraine, to take Ukrainians, to transform them into Russians, and which is not possible indeed, but they didn't know. Even many people in the West think that Ukrainians and Russians, they are more or less the same nation. Why not? So finally, Russia is a patchwork. Russian Federation on paper, empire in fact, is a patchwork of very different peoples and identities and nations, like Austrian Empire, which disappeared. Let me remind that after this, Czech, Slovak republics, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Croatia, and other prominent countries appeared on the map. Then Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, the same story. many nations became free and many states were founded after this empire disappeared. So the same about Russia. Russian empire will disappear for the third time. We in Ukraine and our friends in Europe, in America, and other countries should be interested in manageable transformation of the empire. Not chaotic dissolution with enormous risks, which I mentioned, but with controlled, manageable process, which will lead to creation of new independent states, their international recognition, denuclearization, and growth of international trade, new opportunities for investment and trade, and indeed sustainable peace. And you will ask me, what about Russian-speaking regions? Let's take a look. Though many of Russian-speaking regions have strong local identity. Take Siberia. What is the difference between Siberia and Australia? It's a distant land, very rich by natural resources, inhabited by descendants of adventurers, descendants of criminals, and some indigenous peoples. The same story of Australia and the story of Siberia. So Australia is an independent country, and this is one of the most well-developed countries and most happy country in the world. So Siberia could be. So we underestimate these local identities, which are growing. And indeed, Moscow tries to suppress all these things like they suppress all national identities of different people. For instance, Siberian people, they think they have their own, let's say, dialect. And they created a Wikipedia using their Siberian dialect, which was eliminated by Moscow. So Moscow insisted to prohibit Siberians to have their own Wikipedia version. As well as they insisted that all other nations of Russian Federation should use Cyrillic letters, even when Cyrillic letters are absolutely not suitable for those Turkic, Mongolic, Finno-Ugric, and especially Caucasus, very ancient languages. Because just for some people who are interested in languages and cultures, before Europeans came to Europe, there are some other people there, and that there are just two small islands of people living, which still are there from that time. Basques in Spain and nations of Northern Caucasus. And it's curious that Georgian language from Caucasus is a little bit similar to Basque language in Spain. They belong to the community which no longer exists because several thousand years ago Europeans came and covered all the territory, all those German, Roman, and other Celtic and other tribes push out those people who lived before. So these cultures still are there, and they still would like to be free, and they still have great economic potential. And last but not least about economic potential. Moscow pumps out all resources from these lands and paying nothing to local people. Take Republic of Sakha. They have oil, they have gas, they have gold, they have diamond, they have rare earth metals, they have everything. They have more than half of periodic chemical table. They have whatever you want for modern economy, and they are one of the poorest nations in the world, with biggest diamonds on this planet. How it's possible?
The Kremlin.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. By the way, you have put this very correct focus on those nations, on those cultures, those languages that are only on the daily basis destroyed inside the Russian Federation, starting from this conscription mobilization of various different nations that Putin actually creates, this social cleaning, very similar to what happened during the Second World War, and erasing them, not showing their existence, limiting it to national songs, dances that will disappear with the next generations. And it is also impossible to monitor anything that happens inside the Russian Federation. And that is why those who want to know may not get access to real data, real numbers, real nationalities of people, how they identify themselves. Have you, like, looking at this subject for quite a long time, knowing the tricks of Russian disinformation, have you noticed any signs that social, economic, or maybe like regional, cultural, like the example of Wikipedia page written in Siberian dialect? Are there any signs and symptoms that similar processes are happening, are brewing in those different territories now controlled by the Kremlin?
Yes, every day. But I would start with the several words which you have used. First, the word erasure. This is exactly what is being held. Erasure of nations, not only languages and cultures, erasure of whole nations. That is why one of the resolutions of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe is entitled Erasure of Cultures. It describes what is being held in Russian Federation. Another resolution of this assembly focuses on the mass mobilization of people, of non-Russians, of those nations. I don't want to call them national minorities. Why? Because they are majorities in their respective countries, you see. They are majorities where they live and where they had their statehood until Moscow came. So this mass mobilization is primarily for those nations. So people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, they don't conscript, they are not conscripted to the army. Who is killed in the action? Mostly people from those nations, Tatars, Bashkirs, Buryats, and so on and so on. And this political resolution of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe states that Moscow systematically and disproportionately mobilizes people from these nations to erase national variety, ethnic variety of the country. This is a very politically correct term, but when I hear erasure of ethnic variety, I hear genocide. Sorry, it is called genocide. It's a strong term.
Some people are more afraid of the term than the genocide itself, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. This is because genocide is far from them and their homes. And then, is something being brewed right now? What is being held now there? So we monitor on everyday basis what is being held in the Russian economy, in local protests, we monitor using some artificial intelligence, semantic trends, let's say, in local social networks and local media. So, and we see a lot of signals every day, and this process is growing like maybe put water on fire, and you will see just few bubbles, then more and more and more and more and more. And then one moment, this is what scientists call phase transition. Clop, switch, and boiling and evaporating starts. And the same here. So when Thomas Gobbs wrote his history of decline of Roman Empire, he told that an empire is declining very, 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 very slowly and then suddenly. So the same is here. We see this very slow decline, very slow degradation of all imperial ties. What imperial ties I mean? First, redistribution of money. When Russian economy is growing, then all local elites have money. When economy is collapsing, like now, and let's state very clearly, Russian economy is collapsing because of war. Then regions which are donors, they pay more. Regions which are recipients, they get less. Russian economy is collapsing because of war. Regions which are donors of imperial budget pay more. Regions which are recipients receive less. and everybody has less money. Second tie, fear. More local protests are, more national identity rise, fear going down. Third, common identity. This is about common past. There is no more common identity. Indeed, Russian propaganda says that everybody in Russia is Russian. This is not true. People feel themselves Tatars, Chechens, and so on. Number four, common ideology. This is about the future. Does Putin administration provides people with certain vision of the future? No, just vision of the past. We should conquer Ukraine, we should conquer Georgia, we should conquer Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, and so on. Nothing. Number five, very tiny imperial tie, which is called a bureaucrat career. So this is a question. If I'm a local member of local elites, how high can I go? In Soviet time, every big nation had its own position within so-called Politburo. Now all nations are eliminated, so they have glass ceiling and cannot go up. It is tiny, it is subtle, but this is a reason why Simon Bolivar failed to create a huge united country in Latin America. And number six, inertia. All this stability exists until first big trigger, like Prigozhin mutiny. So we see decline of all imperial ties. And that means that one day there will be one of two triggers and everything will disappear in a moment. I would like to remind the history of Soviet Union. In the beginning of 1991, Soviet Union was a strong nuclear country, strong enough to share responsibility for the planet with the United States. Half of the world were countries clients of Soviet Union. A referendum in March 1991 shows that more than 70% of people voted for preserving of Soviet Union. On the Christmas of the same year, 1991, Soviet Union disappeared as a political unity. Its flag was fall down and its first and last president, Gorbachev, was dismissed in 1 year. So we shall see the same. And it's extremely important that we had not a chaotic process of dissolution of everything with many conflicts and unacceptable risks, but controllable process. And what it is necessary to do now, to speak with local elites, to acknowledge their existence, to understand that they exist, to understand that they would like to be free. And Ukrainian tradition, by the way, proves this. During Second World War, as far as 1943, Ukrainian nationalists gathered representatives of other national liberation movements across the whole Soviet Union and stated, no one country could be free, no one nation could be free, while some other are unfree, some other are colonized, which means that could be gathered, mobilized, and sent to imperial war. That is why that time brought us several mottos. Freedom for people, freedom for nations. For and your freedom, and so on. And we still stick to these mottos that freedom is not for free, and freedom is not partial. When some people are slaves, other people could not be free. Americans know this pretty well.
I hope that a lot of Americans are watching us and they share our opinion because they also go through quite difficult times. You know, you've explained it so naturally. It's a process that has actually already started, and maybe even Russian war against Ukraine and other former Soviet republics is a sign of that dying of the monstrous Frankenstein of the Federation. And I would like to ask you this final question, to be responsible, to be proactive. in this process of decolonization, in this process of the agony of the Russian Federation, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, all these projects, what could be the most normal, the most sustainable role of Ukraine and maybe some of our allies to make this process like safe, sustainable, and with less dangers to the world?
My recipe is very simple. First, to ask ourselves what is necessary to ensure national security of our respective countries. The United States, Canada, Ukraine, Germany, Poland, Finland, and so on. Second, to ensure our national security, which scenarios are possible in Russia, which are not possible, and which are probable, which not. Which scenarios are good for our countries, for respective countries, for Germany, for France, and which are bad for our countries. Third, if there are some scenarios which are good for our countries, what should we do to ensure these scenarios and to avoid those who are bad for us, who are dangerous for us? And we immediately will come to the idea that there are some scenarios which we could not see before, but they are good for us because they ensure our security and prosperity. And then recognize the reality, accept the reality, that reality is much more complicated than Moscow propaganda tries to outline, to speak to local leaders, to speak to national movements, to create a coalition. Now we have anti-Putin coalition, but it is not enough, because after Putin will be Putin 2.0.
Millions of Putins.
Should we after that create a second coalition against Putin 2.0? I mean, his descendant, political descendant, and the person who will continue the war and try to conquer again some European countries. We need a coalition for freedom. We need a coalition for sustainable peace. This is much more than simply anti-Putin coalition. We need not Putin just to die. We need to ensure sustainable peace in Europe and security for all other countries, including Canada, Australia, and the United States. This is what we need. And immediately we shall see some good scenarios, and we should follow this.
Thank you so much, Valerii, for doing all that, for knowing all that, and for sharing all that. And I do hope that more people who watch us, or more people who are interested in this global future of the planet, will realize that this scenario is inevitable, and our task is just to be prepared and to know how to act for the safety and security of our correspondent countries and of the planet in general. And also, please think about those nations that right now are suffering and disappearing inside this monstrous Frankenstein of the Russian Federation. We cannot close our eyes, because none of the nations, none of the countries will be fully free and happy if such things are happening now in the 21st century for so many peoples, for so many languages, cultures, and so on. Thank you so much.